Hi everyone, and welcome to the Festive Tech Calendar 2023, and specifically to Ding Dong Merrily on Hybrid 2023 edition, or should I say 23H2 edition, where I'm going to walk you through a number of the new capabilities in the recently released public preview of Azure Stack HCI 23H2, dropping lots of hints along the way and showcasing how easy it is to take advantage of some of these new capabilities. I'm McSpirit, engineering technologist at Dell, focused on the Azure hybrid technologies, Azure Stack HCI, AKS Hybrid, and Azure Arc, all running on the awesome Dell Apex Cloud platform for Microsoft Azure. But enough about me, what are we going to cover in the session? Well, I've got 5 festive gifts that I'm going to share with you through the course of the session, the first of which is covering the new and very exciting cloud deployment for your Azure Stack HCI 23H2 clusters. So let's take a look. Okay, so let's first take a look at our environment. What you see here running on my Hyper-V host is I have 5 virtual machines, Domain Controller Management VM, Windows Admin Center VM, and 2 nested Azure Stack HCI cluster nodes that have been deployed. They've got about 48 gig of RAM. They are not domain joined, but they're ready to start the setup process. Now let's hop over to my Management VM, because there's a few things that we need to do from a prereq perspective, firstly in Azure. So here I am in the Azure portal now, and I've already got a resource group that I've defined here. And what I'm going to show you quickly is the importance and the correct settings to have in place for this resource group in terms of permissions. So if I go to view my access, my user who I'm logged in as has both contributor and user access administrator role assignments. This is very important. And the Key Vault administrator as well. These are all important for deploying the preview of Azure Stack HCI 23H2. Now, this may change in the future, but this is what was provided as a requirement for this current release. So make sure you're at the resource group level and subscription level, you've got those relevant things configured. So back home we go. Now, still within our management VM, I'm going to open a PowerShell window here and walk you through all of the relevant prereq settings that we need to apply to stage and get this clustered infrastructure ready before we orchestrate the deployment. So you'll see here we've got a number of Active Directory related parameters and settings, including cluster names, user accounts that will be created, and passwords. Needs to be a strong password there, at least 12 characters. So we're going to lock all of those different parameters in, and these are going to be used during the initial pre-configuration process of Active Directory. So let's lock those in. And then on my management server, I'm going to go ahead and install a number of PowerShell modules that are going to be required. You'll see one key module there, the Azure Stack HCI AD Artifact Pre-Creation Tool. That's going to be used a bit later on with those parameters I just described. I'm going to install a couple of extra Windows features on the management machine that's going to make things a little bit easier. I'm going to install or make sure there's available the key distribution service root key. We want to make sure that's available as well, so all that's in place. And now the final step of this AD prep stage is to call that particular PowerShell module and pass in all of those necessary parameters. And what's going to happen in the background here, or in the foreground, and then we're going to see what's happened in the background, is a load of user accounts, computers, and a whole host of other things are going to be created ahead of time that will be used during the deployment. So if I now go to AD users and computers here, what we'll see is if I expand the usual domain, there we go, there's our OU that's been created in there, there's the cluster that's currently disabled, the nodes that are part of that cluster, and a whole host of accounts that are relevant to this particular cluster. And there's that deploy user account that we saw in the parameters as well with that strong password. That's going to be used by the cloud deployment process we're going to see in a minute in order to orchestrate the deployment. Now, if I had multiple clusters, I'd need to do this multiple times. Once we've done that AD prep, there's a couple of steps we want to make sure are in place on the nodes and in the infrastructure in general. So firstly, I'm going to connect to Azure, and this is going to prompt me with the usual, because I'm using device authentication, the usual link to open, the device login link, and as well as that, the code that I will use to log in. Now, in my browser window, I'm already logged into Azure, so I can simply paste this in and go and grab the code that I need. And once I have that code, I can simply copy that and place that in. I don't need to log in again because I'm already logged in this particular browser. So we'll choose my Azure Stack HCI admin account from my tenant, and authorize that particular application. And close that. And here we are again, go back to PowerShell. And you'll see now I'm logged in. I've got my particular subscription, the tenant ID, and so on. If you've got multiple subscriptions for a particular user, then you can run this particular script and it will present you with a view of those multiple subscriptions, or if you've just got the one, it will lock in that parameter as your subscription ID. Now, a load of different parameters here around the choices we want to make in terms of server names, our Azure Stack HCI node names, resource group in Azure, tenants. Some of these have already been locked in, so make sure you're careful about filling those in. Then we're going to just run this script to add our servers to the trusted host file for the management node so that we can communicate with that a little bit more easily. We'll clean that up a little bit later. We're going to update the password on those Azure Stack HCI nested nodes because it was an insecure password. Now it's moving to that 12 plus character secure password. So we're doing that remotely. We're updating the password to match our deploy user. We're updating our credentials we've got in this particular PowerShell session to reflect those new creds. Then we're going to remotely install a couple of roles and features on the Azure Stack HCI nodes, those two nodes. Hyper-V, failover clustering, a couple of others as well included in there. We're going to go ahead and we're going to create a run as account that we're going to use temporarily to update these nodes. So we're just going to create a virtual account. Optionally, you can run this start sleep to buy yourselves a little bit more time, just let the settings settle down. But I'm going to select and trigger this update process. Now, what's happening here is the PowerShell session is communicating with those two nodes. It's triggering a check for updates. It's installing any that are necessary. And this just ensures that our nodes are in a state of updatedness before we start the rest of the deployment process. All of these steps are available in the guidance I'll provide with the session, and you can find them in the Azure Stack HCI docs as well. So we'll clean up that session. We'll reboot the nodes. I'm doing all this from PowerShell just to make it simple and quick and easy. You could obviously manually log on to the nodes and do many of these updating tasks and rebooting tasks and so on. But just doing it from PowerShell is that bit easier. We'll run this test net connection, just make sure that the nodes are responding, so they're back up and running. Sometimes nodes reboot twice when a Hyper-V is installed, so that's something to bear in mind. And now we're at the tail end of the process where we're just going to install on the nodes themselves some required modules for the upcoming deployment that we're going to walk through. So it's going to deploy NuGet, the Azure Stack HCI Arc installer module, which is going to get these nodes ready for Azure Arc, and some Azure modules, AZ accounts, AZ resources. So once all those things are done, the only things that are left, we want to make sure on our two NIC nodes, so our nodes have two network adapters, that we've only got one default gateway. Just seems to make the process of deployment go that little bit more streamlined. So we're making sure through this little simple script that we disable the default gateway and DHCP on one of the NICs so that we just have a single default gateway. And once that's all finished and present and correct, we can go ahead and essentially kick off the initialization of the Azure Stack HCI nodes themselves. So this is going to invoke a particular module that's going to pass in a number of those subscription, resource group, tenant information, etc. that we've been building so far earlier on. And it's going to essentially trigger the installation and configuration of the Arc agent on these Azure Stack HCI nodes. So nothing is getting domain joined yet. Nothing is getting configured from a networking perspective. Literally what's happening in the background is the nodes are being checked for their communication to Azure. Can they reach all the right locations and endpoints in Azure? Installing agents and extensions on those nodes as well. And what you end up with is essentially two nodes, in this case, that are Arc enabled, that will be visible, as we'll see in a moment, from the Azure portal, so that we can then orchestrate and continue the deployment of this cluster from Azure. We do not have a cluster yet. We have not configured anything beyond just preparing these Azure Stack HCI nodes. Now, I stepped through that script. I could have run it in one big go, but in this case, I chose not to. Let's go to our resource group that we saw earlier on. And what we see in the resource group is two nodes, two machines that have been Arc enabled. So straight off the bat, we have visibility from Azure of these non-domain joined Azure Stack HCI nodes. They are not a cluster yet, they're just prepared. And you'll see when we look at the extensions, it's important to wait until these extensions here all show as succeeded. So it might take up to 10 minutes for that to happen, but make sure you do that before continuing. So yeah, we can hit refresh. It's still creating. The Lifecycle Manager one does tend to take a little bit longer, but once that's finished, you are now in a position to start deploying the Azure Stack HCI cluster. And in order to do that, previously we would have used Windows Admin Center or PowerShell. Now I'm going to use, in 23H2, I'm going to use the Azure portal, and specifically the Azure Arc and Azure Stack HCI processes that Microsoft have built here to orchestrate that. So I don't need to choose any hardware. I've got that already. I don't need to download the software for Azure Stack HCI because it's already deployed. I want to look at this third step on the right-hand side here, deploy my cluster in preview. Because when you're using 23H2, you can step through this cloud-based deployment. And so what I have here is, first off the bat, make sure that we've done all the necessary preparation, prepare your Active Directory and connect the servers to Arc. We've done that. Now we can start to provide the necessary information. So my cluster name should match what I've provided previously in the AD setup stage that we saw earlier. I'm going to create a key vault that's going to maintain and store secrets for this deployment, cryptographic keys, BitLocker information, and more. So that's built into the wizard. There's our two servers that we've already pre-configured. We're just going to do some final validation on those, make sure everything's all fine and dandy. And there we go, green is good, so we can proceed. Now onto the configuration. We've got the option of either running through this wizard from scratch or providing a template. So maybe we've gone through the wizard once before and we've got a template that we can reuse. We'll see that shortly. Now in terms of networking, we can choose switchless or switched configurations for our networking config. In my case, I'm going to choose switched. Now in this case, I'm going to choose to group all the traffic across our two NICs and create a single intent that encompasses compute, management, and storage. And I'm going to bind that to the two NICs within my host. And Network ATC is going to take care of all of the rest, all of that configuration of those networking settings. We can choose our appropriate RDMA protocol if that's relevant, not so much in a nested environment, and all of the necessary settings will be applied. Now, in terms of IP addresses, I'm going to put in a start and end range for my infrastructure deployment here for Azure Stack HCI and some of the Arc services. So it needs 6 IPs, it's telling me. So I'm given a range of 10. I'm overly generous. Default gateway, DNS servers, all of that stuff gets popped in here as well. Now, if we continue on to management, what we see here is, if we make sure you scroll to the top, because some settings you need to make sure you complete at the top as well, we need to provide a Cloud Witness storage account. Thankfully, that wizard is built in here as well, similar to the Key Vault one. So we create a little storage account that's going to be used by this very small file that's going to act as our cluster witness to our 2-node cluster. It's tiny. It will cost you pennies a year, if that, for this storage account. It's very, very small in terms of its consumption. So once that part of the wizard is completed, we need to make sure then that we're able to provide those same Active Directory parameters and information that we saw earlier when we prepared Active Directory. So make sure you use the same domain, in my case, Dell.hybrid, and provide the computer name prefix that you provided to that prep script earlier, and you can refer back to that if you like. There's the prefix. I'm going to grab my OU. Do not copy and paste the quotes. Paste it in without the quotes. How do I know? Because I did it and it broke. So just use no quotes around the OU information. Grab your username, your deployment user that has already been pre-staged in Active Directory. Paste that in so you don't make any mistakes. And grab that strong password. In our case, I'm going to use this particular password. We're going to paste that in as well. It's the same password now as my local admin password, so we'll paste that in. And I'm going to rely on my spelling here to spell out administrator correctly. That's the local admin on the Azure Stack HCI nodes. Now, from a security perspective, I would always recommend going with the recommended. But in a nested environment, I'm going to go for customized. And I'm going to turn off specifically BitLocker for data volumes, because if you don't, the process of enabling BitLocker on those volumes will expand those virtual hard disks that are backing your nested nodes. So you will find you will use a lot more storage. So that's just useful for nested environments. We're going to create workload and infrastructure volumes by default. So that's going to create a couple of CSVs as part of this deployment of this cluster. And then once you click validate, it's going to start the validation process. It's going to run through the cluster resource creation, the relevant permissions in AD. It's going to create a service principal in Azure and start attaching that to the relevant locations in Azure. It's going to go ahead and perform the necessary Key Vault tasks, including a storage account association to your Key Vault for logging purposes. These are all going to be orchestrated and take a few minutes. And after about 15 minutes or so for a 2-node or 1-node system, you'll find that all of these different elements should be completed, and you'll be in good shape to kick off your deployment. And so if something fails, you can try again. You can go back and make some changes and keep trying, but hopefully you make it through that step without any issues. After the summary and the review stage, everything you've entered already is in place, and you can click Review and Create. And that is going to kick off the deployment and configuration of an Azure Stack HCI cluster from the cloud against your on-prem infrastructure. And if you want to templatize this for future standardized deployments, I can click on Save this deployment here. You'll see there's my current deployment that's happening. And if I click on View Template, here's all the information, the template that's essentially going to get used and created. And I could reuse in the future all of this information to essentially standardize the deployment of future Azure Stack HCI clusters. I think this is incredibly useful. Infrastructure as code for configuring your on-prem Azure Stack HCI clusters. I'd need to adjust and change some of the values, some of the figures in this configuration, but ultimately what I'm left with here is a very powerful way to orchestrate and standardize deployment of my Azure Stack HCI clusters. And I'm just scrolling through all the different ARM template JSON information here. No bicep template for now, but that's something that might come in the future. So let's go back to the deployments view and refresh, see if anything's cropped up yet. No, not just yet. That might take a few minutes, but once it does, it will look something like this, where you'll see all of the different steps that are underway for deployment of that cluster. Now, it's going to take a couple of hours. This isn't a 5-minute process to get through, and you might find that it doesn't update for a while. It stays on that check requirements stage for a little bit longer than you might want, but rest assured, if you want to check in the background with PowerShell, lock in your server names here as a parameter, provide the local admin credentials as a couple of parameters, and then run this command, which is in the documentation. I can provide links to this as well, don't worry. Before the domain join happens, which will take a while to get to domain join, you run this script and it passes in those credentials you've just locked in. And what this will result in is a nice kind of list view of all the steps, a little bit more granular than what's in the portal, but you can see where steps have been already completed. So you get a bit more of an idea of how long some of these things have taken, what's in progress, etc., what contributes towards a bigger step within the process, like that check requirement step. You'll see that a bit further down the list, is join the domain. So that doesn't actually happen until a bit later on. But that stage, once you've reached that stage, running this command as it is highlighted won't work. So you have to change to a now domain joined command that you can run. And that will just use the credentials of the management server VM, which, you know, you're part of the domain there. So that'll be fine. You don't need to pass in the separate credentials. Now, fast forward a little bit. And after about, 2 hours and 15 minutes, I have an Azure Stack HCI cluster deployed, all from the cloud, all orchestrated. I went away and had multiple cups of tea. And you can see in this case that there are now lots of these stages that have all been completed successfully. If something does fail, you can rerun the deployment and it will pick up where it left off. So that's pretty reliable in that respect. But what we have now is essentially an Azure Stack HCI cluster deployed, ready to move on and explore deployment of additional workloads and more. We can see that we've got the 2 nodes that have been deployed. They're connected to Azure Arc, and we're going to look through a number of these capabilities as we go forward later on. Now, in addition, we can also take a quick look at what's been deployed in the background. So I've gone onto my management server here and looking at the failover cluster manager. I always like to search for the word fail and find that one, quite ironic. And we'll see here under roles. Oh, look, there we go. not just a simple cluster anymore. There's a whole host of things that are deployed by default, which if you'll see the top one there is incredibly important. That is the Arc resource bridge that's been deployed as part of the overall cluster deployment. This used to be a separate step. And that Arc resource bridge has been fully orchestrated. All the deployment has happened. And inside there, not only is the ability to start doing more stuff from a management perspective in Azure, but also the Azure Kubernetes service pieces are in there. So we are now ready to deploy Kubernetes clusters as well. So we'll take a look at that a bit later on. Loads of services, loads of things are deployed, but all orchestrated for us. So now that the cluster's deployed, let's move on and take a look at how easy it is to start deploying VM workloads onto this cluster from Azure. Now, this process has been in preview for a while for use with Azure Stack HCI 22H2, but it's been refreshed for this new preview and is now exclusively reserved for use with 23H2 clusters. So let's take a quick look around. So if we bring up the Azure portal here and back end looking at our Azure Stack HCI cluster, if we go over to the left-hand side here, what we can see is a number of options relating to virtual machines, logical networks, disks, and I'm going to start with storage paths, because these storage paths have been pre-created for us, and they're an Azure representation of an on-prem cluster storage path. So you'll see the paths there in the middle. They represent and are mapped to an artifact in Azure. And in order to create another one for use by virtual machines and workloads, you need to have the on-prem, the on-the-cluster storage path already in place, and you can set up that mapping. And that can be then used for VM deployments and storage of VM workloads from Azure. Now, under VM images here, what you'll see is I've got no images. And this means that I can't yet deploy any VMs from Azure against my on-prem cluster. But in order to add any images, I've got a couple of options. I can add from the Azure Marketplace. This is probably the easiest. And what I essentially need to do here is provide a name and choose from a curated list provided by Microsoft of images, Windows 10, Windows 11, great for VDI, Windows Server as well, some of those are additional options. Those are all options that I can download automatically now from Azure to my Azure Stack HCI cluster and store it at the appropriate storage path on premises, wherever I determine. There's the two that we saw earlier on. And then I can use those images for VMs being deployed going forward. So that's really useful. Now, if I come out of this particular image deployment option, and I could choose from an Azure storage account. So maybe I've created a VM in Azure in the past and I've essentially customized and sysprep that to become a golden image for other deployments. I could use that, but I'm going to choose from a local share here. And from a local share essentially says, have you got a virtual machine image that's suitable, stored somewhere in your cluster that you can use for this purpose? Now, as part of our automated deployment of our sandbox, it turns out that we do have one. So I'm going to go all the way back to our Hyper-V host here. And you'll see there's our 5 VMs we saw earlier on. And I'm going to look, in this case, as part of this deployment, I'm going to first, because I want to copy a file into this node, into this cluster. So I'm going to go to the integration service of this VM and turn on guest services, because that's going to allow me to copy files into the VM using PowerShell from outside. So in this case, if I look at my path to my MS Lab, my hybrid jumpstart configuration, you'll see that I've got essentially a virtual hard disk that I can use. It's about 6 gig in size. It's the smallest one I've got. So I'll essentially use this one as a means of providing a quick and easy way of getting an image in place. So I've got a script here that's going to use PowerShell Direct to copy a VM file from my host to that VM that's listed there. So the source path is on my host machine. There's the VHDX. The destination path is going into that repository inside the cluster. So I'm just essentially side-loading this virtual hard disk in. If you've got one that's different, you can always use that as well. This is going to take a few moments to copy. So we will fast forward. And once that's done, we can take that path. It's easier if I copy and paste it this way, a little bit more reliable. So I'll copy it from there. I'm going to go back to the Azure portal inside my management VM. I'm going to go to add VM image from a local share. And what it needs as part of this, a couple of pieces of basic information. Give it a name. In this case, I'm going to give it the name Windows Server 2022, core, and G2 to represent generation 2. I'll get my typos going there. G2, there we go. It's a Gen 2 image. It's a Windows image. and I'm going to store it. It knows it's a local file share. Where is it on my cluster? Well, that's the path that I've just copied or pasted in this case from my copy. And then it's going to be placed in a particular location on the cluster. In this case, I'll choose the user storage 1 cluster shared volume. That's what that mapping is there for. So we'll go ahead, we'll review, and we'll create. And that's going to take a few moments to handle all that mapping, locate that virtual machine in the correct place, and get it ready for multiple deployments from that golden image. So that's a really easy way to use a local image in order to start provisioning VMs from that gold image. And within a few minutes, that image has been successfully added as a representation, as an artifact in Azure, within your Azure Stack HCI purview, such that now I can use it for VM deployments. So if I go back to my Azure Stack HCI cluster, and if I go to, just to confirm, under VM images, you'll see it should be there. There we go. Available, customer managed, represents something that I've provided. Next, we've got to add some logical networks in order to deploy VMs that then can communicate out. And in order to create a logical network, we provide some very basic information, logical network name. And I've actually prepared this in advance, so I'm just going to copy and paste this in, save me typing a little bit. There we go. Critically important is to map this to the correct virtual switch name on the host cluster. So make sure you grab the right virtual switch name from your Azure Stack HCI cluster nodes, and that's going to create a mapping. The network config, choose static or DHCP. So I'm going to flip mine over to DHCP, provide a VLAN ID if you're using one. And what this ultimately is doing is providing a means for virtual machines that you deploy from Azure against your on-prem infrastructure to be able to communicate on a network. Because if you don't create this, then your VMs will you can deploy VMs, but you cannot join them to any network. They will just sit there isolated from each other. So that logical network plays an important part of that. Once that's finished, we'll fast forward a little bit here because that does take a few moments to create that logical network. And there you see that was succeeded. We're back in the logical networks view, and I can then use this for subsequent VM deployments. Speaking of which, go into the virtual machines view here. I can now use Azure Arc and the Azure experience to graphically or programmatically create a VM from Azure and have it run on my on-prem infrastructure. So I'll provide some simple information here, resource group, give it a name. In this case, test 001 is my go-to, very original. Now, some settings are locked already. We know it's a virtual machine that's going to run on Azure Stack HCI, but I can now adjust the security level of this VM. I might want to use the new trusted launch VM that's going to use things like Generation 2, Secure Boot, VTPM, but none of my images are ready for that yet. So I should probably download one from the Azure portal to take advantage of that. I don't have one. My Windows Server 2022 image doesn't have that. So I'm going to choose standard security and Windows Server 2022 core image that we added earlier. Provide some final piece of information about the VM, size, etc. Do I want to enable guest management? So do I want to drop an agent inside that virtual machine as well? In this case, I'm not going to, but I could do. Provide some credentials. Interesting to know, if I did want to enable guest management, I have to connect that virtual machine to a network. I can add some additional data disks. If I want to, beyond the OS disk, I can add a network interface and attach it to the logical network you created previously. If you don't do this step, your virtual machine will not communicate anywhere. It's an isolated VM. I've got tags. I've got the option to add tags and values. I know this is going to be a resource of type Azure Stack HCI VM. And finally, I get my summary view and I can go ahead and create. But here's the cool thing. The ARM template, the JSON template that I can use and reuse again to deploy a virtual machine against this Azure Stack HCI cluster. So even though this is going to live on-prem, I've got a specific type, API, all these different parameters that I can feed in that essentially allow me to customize and standardize VM deployments to my different locations from Azure using a very standardized, familiar to Azure people means of doing so. So that's, I think, is really powerful there. So back out of there, I'm not going to deploy this VM for now. I just wanted to show you what the experience is like and what you can look forward to being able to utilize in the not too distant future. So we've got a cluster up and running. We've walked through deploying a VM workload. But what about lifecycle management and maintenance of this particular cluster? Well, traditionally, you'll have applied updates to Azure Stack HCI clusters from within Windows Admin Center. But now, there's a new approach that's getting baked into the overall Azure Update Manager experience that handles the lifecycle management of your Azure Stack HCI clusters, all from Azure. So let's take a look. So here we are in the update view, looking at the updates preview operations view for a single Azure Stack HCI cluster. So we're just looking at one cluster at this point in time. And what we can instantly see from this view is the status. We're up to date. This is a newly deployed cluster, so there aren't any updates yet. We can see that we're up to date. We can see that the readiness is healthy, the current OS version, and if we had have applied an update previously, we'd see that last successful update. But let's pop over to Azure Update Manager. And there's new functionality that is exposed specific to Azure Stack HCI here, which aggregates views across many of our clusters, all of our clusters. It could be 2 here, but it could be 200 in this list. And we can get a quick and instant view of the cluster status, current OS version, readiness, health, etc., all as they pertain to our update status. So not only do we get that quick view, but I can select one or many clusters, click one-time update here, and not only do I see all of the prerequisite checks that are going to be performed to ensure that the application of these updates is going to be successful, but also, should I then click next, I would see all the updates applicable to all of the selected clusters that I could then go ahead and apply. And it would orchestrate the process of migrating VMs around and keeping those workloads up and running. You'll see here I've got no updates to install because these are fresh installations, but I could then go ahead and click install and the process would kick off. This is phenomenal innovation that helps me manage multiple Azure Stack HCI clusters at scale from one location. Awesome stuff. So in addition to updating, there's been some significant improvements in how you monitor your Azure Stack HCI clusters. And historically, many organizations have used traditional tools like System Center Operations Manager for monitoring on-prem Microsoft infrastructure. But with Azure Stack HCI being an Azure service, it makes significantly more sense to weave in deeper integration with Azure's native monitoring capabilities. And what I'm going to show you now certainly reflects that. So let's take a look. So here we are in our Azure Stack HCI cluster that we previously deployed, and we're looking at the monitoring tab within the navigation here, just on the left-hand side. And I want to show you how easy it is to turn on monitoring for this particular cluster. So we click on Get Started, and it's going to help us configure the Azure Stack HCI Insights. Now, we have no data collection rules right now, so we're going to create a new one. And this is essentially going to define how we collect data from our Azure Stack HCI cluster. I've got a dedicated resource group I'm going to use to collect all the metrics, and I'm going to provide a name of our data collection rule, and it's going to add the Azure Stack HCI information to that particular name as well. So I've provided a name. I'm going to select my data collection endpoint, just going to choose the default one that's going to get created here, and where the data will be stored, specifically in a log analytics workspace, I'm going to put that in my dedicated resource group as well. And ahead of time, I've created this log analytics workspace because that takes a few minutes. So I just went through the wizard to create that as well ahead of time. So that's all done for me. So let's click Review and Create. And what we see now is a summary of the data collection rule that's going to be created, 5 performance counters from those operating systems, 2 from the Windows event log, and it's going to be stored in that particular log analytics workspace. So that's going to take a few minutes to get going. And what you'll see looking at the extensions view here for my Azure Stack HCI cluster is that some additional extensions are being deployed to this particular Azure Stack HCI cluster, both of physical nodes in this environment. So we'll do a quick refresh here. It's now at the creating stage. So we will come back. There we go. That's now completed. And we'll see that those agents have now been deployed and should be reporting back to the centralized repository. So going back to Insights here, letting that load for a moment. And you'll see straight off the bat in this new view that we can enable specific monitoring of certain features that are getting exposed. A new one in 23H2 being REFS dedupe and compression. And if we click Enable selected there, we see a nice visual of what that would look like. This is going to essentially add more performance counters and event channels to the data collection rule that we've already got in place associated with this cluster. So I don't need to do anything else apart from just click the button here, but I'm going to cancel out of there because I'm not using those capabilities right now. Looking at health, everything looks good. No health faults on this cluster, all good. We can see in our servers view here that within this single cluster, we've got 2 nodes, useful information about each of these different nodes, CPU, memory, number of processors, etc. And we get some very pretty graphs that are generated from the data that's been uploaded into that log analytics workspace. This is the insights we're getting into the data that's been sent up. Looking at the virtual machines view, just the one VM deployed in my environment right now, and that VM is essentially the resource bridge VM that's being deployed as part of the overall deployment process. Now, if we look at storage, we can also see useful information about all the different volumes that were deployed as part of this cluster deployment, the user volumes, the infrastructure volumes, and lots of useful graphs and information about the usage of those particular clusters. So it's great to have the centralized view of all of this information in one place in this nicely presented set of insight and views. So that's great that we get to view all of that information about this particular cluster. But let me go over to Azure Monitor, the centralized monitoring solution within Azure for all sorts of different services and applications. And you'll see Azure Stack HCI on the left here has a dedicated entry within Azure Monitor. And this is where we can aggregate monitoring information, not just from one cluster, but from all of the clusters that we've enabled for insights. So in my case, I've got 2 clusters. I've enabled them both now through that same process we just saw. And I get very similar information that we just looked at for one cluster, but now bubbled up for one-to-many clusters. We can see the breakdown of these clusters, 2 nodes in each cluster, how long they've been up for, their CPU, their memory, virtual machines aggregated across all of those different clusters, their health, their state, and the same is true of the storage information like we just saw for the individual cluster. We now see the storage information regarding all of those different clusters that are aggregated into this one view. So lots of really useful information that we're aggregating into a centralized monitoring location. Drilling into that storage view, we see the breakdown by volume. We can see the pretty graphs that we saw earlier on. Lots of great insights that are being created and crafted for us in rich views, building on that raw information that's coming up from the nodes. And because this is based on a very customizable experience, you can create your own as well. Now, let's go to the single cluster, the Azure Stack HCI Cluster 1 that we've been focusing on a lot of our time. And what I want to talk through now is going beyond monitoring specifically. There's the insights view that we've enabled previously. And how can I start to get alerted about things that are happening within my environment? So to turn on alerts, we simply click on Turn On for health alerts. And this is in preview. You'll see another extension is being installed to our Azure Stack HCI cluster nodes, just like it was for when we enabled insights. So if we head over to the extensions view now, what we can see is, just like we saw earlier, the extensions are being created. One of them's already finished. That was quick. And now both of them have finished with the power of editing. So that was nice and quick. If we go to the alerts view here, we currently have no alerts. So let's create an alert rule. In this case, I'm going to first create a signal, so something I want to detect. And in this case, I'm going to view all, and we can see there's a whole host of ones that have been pre-created for us, examples and more. I'm going to go to this memory used platform metric. This is one that came in the box. And I'm essentially going to determine that, looking at my cluster's memory usage on each node, that I want to track when my memory usage on a node is gone over 4 gigabytes, which ultimately will be all the time when I'm running virtual machines. But that's intentional for this demo because I want to understand what the alerting progress and situation looks like. So in this case, we're going to check every 1 minute. We're going to check the previous 5 minutes of data. And in terms of actions, firstly, what I'm going to do is select an existing action group. So I've created one ahead of time that's basically a group of users or email accounts or phone numbers that are going to be contacted when this alert fires. And if I show you what some of those options are when you're creating an action group, firstly, the basics, where do you want to put this particular action group? Now, notification type reflects things like email, text message, voice calls, And in this case, I'm going to provide an email. I could provide my phone number. I'm not quite sure what it would be like to receive a phone call from Azure, but I'm sure that's very interesting. Now, under Actions, we also get the opportunity to add some additional actions as a result of this alert. So it could be running a runbook, triggering a function, integrating with an ICSM system, a whole host of choices there. Next, under Details, we provide a bit more information about the alert that's going to notify and be provided as part of that notification to the user. So this alert rule name is going to be massive memory usage. Remember, 4 gig is our threshold per node. And watch out. But in addition, we can provide some custom properties to help customize that information that we're providing to the recipient or the system. We can add tags just like any other Azure resource. And in this case now, we're at the end of the wizard, and we'll see that this is going to cost me 10 cents a month. And the summary of the information is going to go out via email. There's lots of other useful summary information here, so we can go ahead and click Create. And that's going to go ahead and create that rule and start comparing what the rule is looking for against our log analytics data that we've been capturing. And by the power of editing, if we fast forward, we'll see that in 5 minutes' time, an alert has been fired. Who knew that our systems would go over 4 gig of memory usage? Well, it's happened. And we can see all the alert information, including a really useful view as when that particular threshold was exceeded and by how much. In this case, we can see that it's gone nearly 3 gigabytes over the threshold, which isn't ideal. And we can view some more useful information about that particular alert as well. So lots of useful stuff. And the nice thing about all of this, I can share this information. It's very customizable, but it's all very intuitive and very easy to set up, which is key. Now, in addition to that, if I want to view a slightly different look at this particular alert, we can see a timeline view that gives me a different representation of that same data and when things happen, and useful to start to establish some patterns. And here's the email that was sent to me as part of that alert, and you'll see the rule and watch out. There's a description, very useful. Lots more useful information about the alert that's contained within that email. That might determine whether I need to take action right away or not. But what this represents is a great bit of innovation for monitoring and alerting my Azure Stack HCI clusters. And finally, I wanted to take a few minutes to showcase how much easier it is in this preview release to start utilizing next-gen workloads like VDI and Kubernetes on Azure Stack HCI. Now, in previous versions, there were additional deployment steps, time-consuming configuration processes, and more, just to start with some of these next-gen workloads. Well, with 23H2, so much of that process has been embedded into that initial Azure Stack HCI deployment that right from the word go, you're able to start taking advantage of those next-gen workloads on top of your Azure Stack HCI clusters. So let's take a look. So here we are in the Azure portal, and what you can see here in the Azure Stack HCI cluster view is that we've met the prerequisites for deploying Azure Virtual Desktop. So in this case, you can see that the Arc VM management has already been set up. That was handled as part of the deployment of the Azure Stack HCI cluster. And we also have a Windows image now available on the cluster. If you recall, we added that earlier when looking at Arc VM management. Now that was a server OS. Most likely you choose a desktop OS to add as an image. In this case, we're going to click on the link. We're going to go over to the AVD deployment blade and wizard. And you'll see after selecting a few basic pieces of information, desktop or remote app, resource group, etc. If I go to virtual machines here, what you'll see is that we can, by clicking the yes to add virtual machines, we can add virtual machines not only from Azure, but also from Azure Stack HCI. So this is a new integration part of the process. We simply provide our custom location of the chosen cluster we want to deploy to, and you'll see it's pulled in our image that is already recognized as part of this Azure Stack HCI cluster. Now that's Windows Server 2022. We'd probably want to use a desktop image, Windows 10, Windows 11, etc., which we could add as well. And what that means ultimately is now I have a more centralized, orchestrated process for integrating Azure Virtual Desktop and deploying that on top of Azure Stack HCI 23H2. Now let's look at another very popular and common workload, Kubernetes. And with Azure Stack HCI's deployment now handling the deployment of the Arc resource bridge, we've got everything we need to start deploying Kubernetes workload clusters from the word go. We don't need to add anything additional. We don't need to deploy anything extra. So you can see here in the portal, I can go straight to this wizard to create a new workload Kubernetes cluster, provide a resource group, choose or provide, in this case, a name for my target cluster that's going to support my workloads. Then I need to select a custom location, which is pulled in from my Azure Stack HCI cluster now. And then from there, I just go through the standard wizard for deploying a Kubernetes clusters, node pool sizes, VM sizes, credentials, accounts, and more. We'll quickly provide a key pair name here so we can advance through the wizard, provide some more information about our node sizes, VM sizes for the control plane, choose our authentication, which could be local Kubernetes authentication or integration with formerly Azure AD, now Entra. And that, in a nutshell, is essentially a very quick look at how easy it is to now deploy Kubernetes clusters on the same clustered infrastructure as AVD and virtual machines and a whole host more. Awesome stuff, and looking forward to seeing you all try this out in the near future. So, I hope you all found that useful, and as you can see, deploying Azure Stack HCI from Azure through the new cloud-based deployments, quick and easy, and with the deepening integration between Azure Stack HCI and Azure itself, it's clear that Azure Stack HCI is the best platform for hybrid, and I urge you to try it for yourself. So with that, thanks for watching, and happy holidays.